Yeah, let me start by qualifying my claim a little. What works in a society depends a lot on the society. That institutions that work in a society where people like each other and are friendly and don't have any problems might not work in one with a lot of internal conflict. Institutions that work in a society in a peaceful world might not work in a place which had a lot of enemies trying to conquer it. So I do not want to claim that the institutions I argue for would work under all imaginable circumstances. But I would claim that all of the useful things governments do could be done by non-governmental means, by non-governmental mechanisms. That doesn't mean that they wouldn't be done, but that they would be done by people and organizations that only had the same rights as everybody else does. That a government runs schools, but the way it runs schools is to forcibly tax people who aren't going to the schools or whose children aren't going to the schools, and often, depending on the country, to force children to go to the school whether their parents or they want to or not. You do have schools that are private, but those schools have to get their revenue either by donations or by the students or the parents of the students paying for them, and they only get people to study in those schools if people want to study in those schools. There are certainly things that are harder for the market to do, but that's an argument against the market only if they are things that are reasonably easy for government to do. And in many cases, both government and the market have problems, but perhaps at different stages of the process, as it were. So that consider the issue of radio broadcasts. And they're interesting to an economist because they are what we call a public good. A public good to an economist does not mean a good government produces. Some public goods are privately produced, and many of the things government produces are really private goods. A public good is a good where, if it is produced at all, it will be available to all the members of some pre-existing group of people, so that the producer cannot control who gets it. So that if you make a radio broadcast, anybody within a certain distance of the broadcast can get it, whether or not he has paid the broadcaster for permission to do so. And so there's an obvious problem in private markets producing public goods because you have to pay for them. And there are a variety of ingenious ways in which people sometimes solve that problem. We, in fact, have private radio broadcasts. A government does not have that problem because the government can force people to pay for it whether they want or not. But it has a different problem. There are a number of problems with government control of radio broadcasts. One of them is that the government can use them to try to make sure that voters believe what the government wants them to believe instead of what's true or what the people want to believe. A government news service can choose not to cover things the government does that people don't like. It can choose to make everything look good and so forth. So that's one example where there's one problem for the public, one problem for the private, but you can do it either way, and I would argue that on the whole you're better off doing it privately, because now of course the proprietor of a private radio station can also try to bias what he covers, but he can't keep other radio stations from covering other things. And one of the ways in which it's gotten even better now is that now that we have the web, not only can the private radio station not prevent other radio stations from covering a news story, they can't prevent Matt Drudge from covering it, or me from covering it, that essentially anybody with very, very low resources can put up a web page. And if he's reporting things people want to know about, other people will go to that web page. So in that sense, I think that having private radio or private other information, private newspapers, private books, is something which is better than the public version, even when it has some problems. That's an easy one because it's been done historically many times. That I would have said money is too important to leave to the government. That's a case where I don't think there really is a problem from the private, but there is a problem from the public standpoint, because you want certain characteristics to a money. In particular, you would like to know how valuable today's money will be next year and the year after. That probably the worst problem is unpredictable inflation or for that matter, contraction, because people make long-term contracts. You buy a house borrowing money and you agree to pay a certain amount each year, and If after you do that the government inflates and the money becomes worth much less, then the person who lent you the money is in effect losing what he lent you. And if that's likely to happen, people won't lend you money, and that makes it hard to buy houses. So and governments, unfortunately, don't have much of an incentive to do a good job of running money. And they have some incentive to do a bad job for a number of familiar reasons. For one thing, in some countries at some time, the government itself is a debtor. Well, if you're a debtor, you would like to have inflation because now you'll be paying off your debts in money that's worth much less than what you acquired it in. And so that means that governments sometimes have a deliberate incentive to inflate. In addition, increasing the inflation rate tends to have attractive short-term effects because potential workers are more willing to take a job if they think it pays well, and if the prices have been stable for a long time, then they assume that the future wage corresponds to the present wage in terms of its buying power. That's only a temporary effect. The evidence is that if the government starts inflating, pretty soon people figure out what's happening and the unemployment rate goes back to its normal level, but it might be long enough to win an election, and therefore I think governments have an incentive to manipulate money that way. Privately, I don't see there's any real problem with private money. As I say, it's existed. When Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, the first really famous economics book, the money that was used in Scotland consisted of paper banknotes issued by banks, and the banknote was a promise by the bank to pay a certain amount of silver. They used a silver standard. And the bank had silver in its vault. It did not have as much silver as it had promised to pay, but it had other assets. And so if people started coming in and wanting silver for their paper, the bank would give them silver from its vaults, sell other things it owned, and buy silver, and could keep doing that, and if necessary, pay off all of its obligations. By doing it that way, since the amount of silver they had to have was less than the notes they had in effect gotten a free loan from the people holding their money, and that would pay for running the bank. So I don't see any particular problem. I would say probably private money would work somewhat better now than in the past, because one of the worries with private money is that the bank might decide to print a whole lot more money than it has assets, and the person who owns the bank either gambles, hoping he'll win, or he just leaves town. And that's harder to do in a modern world. We have fast communication, so if you start inflating your private money, people are likely to find out about it pretty fast. So yes, I don't think there's any particular reason why governments should be producing money, and pretty serious reasons why they shouldn't be. Again, I don't see that that's one where there are any particularly large problems. There are certainly problems with the present U.S. healthcare system, but it is not really a private system, even though defenders and attackers of it often claim it is. That, for example, if you want to buy insurance against health risks, the insurance company is not free to insure you against whatever you want to be insured against. The insurance is regulated at the state level, not the national level. And as one would expect, the providers of any particular kind of health care have an incentive to get the government to require insurers to include what they provide as part of what's insured, even if the customers don't want it. What that would be would vary state by state. In general, what you want insurance for is not regular and predictable costs, but the small chance of a very expensive cost, and there's no reason why one couldn't provide that privately. The other problem with healthcare really is that the patients need some way of figuring out which doctors to go to, but there's no particular reason, again, why private organization, whether insurance or some other kind of organization, can't provide that, and in many cases they do. The U.S. currently, about half of all healthcare expenses are paid directly by the government, and the other half are paid very largely by insurance, which is a heavily regulated industry. Yes, that's a much more interesting case, and that's the one which actually I've written about and done work on. Now, in a certain odd sense, law is provided privately. There's a private organization in the U.S. of legal scholars. I'm trying to remember its name, but it writes sort of its summary of how it interprets the law. And quite often, state legislatures adopt that with minor changes. I ought to remember its name, but I'm forgetting it. And use that for this. So a lot of law is privately created, but of course they can't make that law. All they can do is make recommendations. On the other hand, a lot of disputes, both commercial disputes within a country and a lot of commercial international disputes, are handled by arbitration. So that you have two firms which agree in advance, if there's a disagreement on our contract, we will go to the following private arbitration organization to settle it. That organization has rules defining how they will do their arbitration, what determines who is guilty or innocent. Well, that's a private law code. So that would be another example. There are also what are really private law codes that all of us live under, although we don't call them laws, and those are social norms, that if you think about all of the things that it is legal for you to do, but that you won't do because people will think badly of you. The standard example I like to give is there is no law to prevent me from teaching my classes naked to the waist. All right, that's not indecent exposure in the U.S. I suppose in some parts of the U.S. I might be cold doing that, but most classes are indoors, so that's not a problem. But I would never do that. And the reason I would never do that, ultimately, is that people would think I was crazy. My reputation would go down in a variety of different ways. And I suspect that if you look at well-functioning societies, a lot of what we think is done by law is really done by private norms. That I'm not sure about this, but as you may know, the poor parts of the inner cities of the U.S. are where the high crime rates are. And maybe the reason is the government does a bad job of enforcing the law. But I think part of the reason is that what normally keeps people from being burglars, one of the things, is that if you're a burglar, probably the people around you are going to know it. And people may not want to rent you an apartment. And if you're a young man, parents may not want you to go out with their daughter. And there are a lot of things of that sort where there are sort of informal controls that give people an incentive to try to have the reputation of being honest, reliable people. And in a system where people are getting their money from welfare, where most of them aren't getting married, some of them are getting their money by selling drugs and such, a lot of those private norms break down. So it is at least possible, and this is not something I'm sure is correct, but it's a conjecture, that a good deal of the reason for those high crime rates has nothing to do with whether the law is or isn't enforced. It has to do with the fact that it isn't really the law that's doing it. And there is an interesting example. There's a book by a Yale law professor, Robert Ellickson, called Order Without Law. And he studied a rural county in California, a few hours from where I live, where by his account, for certain subjects, the law of the state of California did not run. De facto, not de jure. And the reason it didn't run was that there was a strong set of norms of neighborly behavior. People knew how they expected other people who lived in the area to behave. And one of the strong norms of neighborly behavior was that neighbors did not sue other neighbors. And since you knew, therefore, that if somebody did something, there was some conflict with one of your neighbors, and the norms of how you were supposed to act said one thing, and the law of the state of California said another. If you insisted on the law of the state of California, you might win your law case, but other people would think that you weren't a very reliable person. They would be, your wife wouldn't get invited to bridge parties. Your kids might have a hard time getting invited to birthday parties. If you wanted somebody to help you do something, they wouldn't help you, so that you would find that the cost of winning that lawsuit was higher than the benefit. So that was an interesting case where he looked in some detail. This didn't apply to everything, of course. My point is only that there's a lot more private law out there than people realize. What I sketched in my first book, which, as you know, has just been translated into Spanish and released, was how you could have a system in which all of the government law was replaced by private law. And the system that I described was one in which individuals were customers of private firms that sold them the service of protecting their rights, which is one of the things governments are supposed to do, that they often don't, and settling their disputes. So I'm a customer of such a firm, you're a customer of such a firm, and imagine that I think you have stolen my television set. Perhaps I had an automatic camera in my living room, and when somebody stole my television set, it took some pictures, and they look an awful lot like you. And so my rights enforcement agency calls you up, and they say, we believe that you have our customer's television set. Please give it back, along with some money to pay us for the trouble of locating you. And you reply, I do not have his television set. I have a very nice television set, but a friend of mine gave it to me. And it's none of your business how I got it. Go away. And my agency said, well, we're sorry that you're taking this attitude, but if you're not willing to return the television set, we will send 3 big, strong men to your house tomorrow morning, and they'll return the television set. And you say, well, that's very nice, but I too have a rights enforcement agency. And if 3 thugs are going to come to my apartment or my house and take my television set, my agency will send 4 brave men to defend me from them. So it sounds as though this is going to break down into a war between my rights enforcement agency and yours. And many people, when you start describing such a system, that's their initial response. But it's not a very likely response, because these are not governments. They're private profit-making firms, and wars are expensive. Not only are they expensive, customers aren't going to like it very much if you end up having a gun battle in their front yard between 2 sets of agents. And furthermore, you're going to have to pay your employees a good deal more if they might get shot. So it makes much more sense for the 2 agencies to agree to go to an arbitrator, to go to a private court that will agree to settle the dispute. And if I was wrong, then my agency will apologize to you and your agency and give you a little compensation. And if I was right, your agency will agree that my people can collect the television set. Now, that's what would happen if it only happened once. But if you imagine that you have 2 or more such agencies operating in the same territory, they realize that such conflicts will be happening over and over. And so it makes sense to solve the problem in advance. So in the hypothetical society that I described in my book, in part 3 of Machinery of Freedom, in that society, each pair of agencies agree in advance on the private court that will settle their disputes. What enforces that agreement? You might say there's no government in this world to enforce the agreement. But what enforces the agreement is the fact that both of them are repeat players. That each agency knows that if, when the arbitrator rules against it this time, it refuses to go along, the other won't go along the next time, and that will make it very hard to do business and protect its customers and not get people shot and lots of other things it would like to do. So that's the basic system. And in that system, the law is being created by the private court, but it's being created on a competitive market. That if the 2 agencies think there's another court that does a better job of making laws that their customers want to live under, they can switch to another court by mutual agreement. And thus you get a system in which laws are being made in effect on the free market by private firms which have an incentive to make good law. And unfortunately, governments do not have an incentive to make good law, which is why we have so much bad law in the world. I don't think there's any set of institutions that's guaranteed to work in all imaginable circumstances. That democracy, a lot of people are in favor of, but after all, the democracy of the Weimar Republic led to Hitler. I guess, brief democracy during the period leading up to the Bolshevik Revolution led to Stalin, and so forth. On the other hand, democracy in Spain and the U.S., although it works much less well than I would like it to work, we are alive, people rarely arrest us for what we say. On the whole, by historical standards, we have things pretty well, even though I think it could be better. So no, I could imagine circumstances in which my society would not work. And in terms of the particular problem you mentioned, which I discussed in some detail in my book, which was written 40 years ago, and we'll say a little bit more about when I do the 3rd edition sometime soon, the question, I think, is how many rights enforcement agencies there are. That if you imagine that there are only 2 or 3, they might well conclude that robbery is more profitable than business and recreate government. That say, why should we have to have willing customers? We can have customers and tell them you're our customers, whether you like it or not, which is what governments do. On the other hand, if there are 50 or 100 such agencies, it seems to me that's going to be very hard to do, because if a few of them start doing it, their customers all leave them for the agencies that leave them free to move around. And that's, I think, the typical pattern in other markets, that if you have only 2 or 3 firms, there is a real possibility of their forming a cartel, reducing the amount they produce, raising prices, and so forth. Whereas if you have 50 or 100 firms, that's very unlikely to happen. Well, I don't know what you need. all I'm saying is that I can imagine things that wouldn't work. So I could imagine a functioning society where you had several very different groups. It might be easier if everybody had shared values, but you could also imagine there are different values, but people realize this is as much as I can hope to get of what I want and so forth. So I don't think I can state what the requirements are, but I can only say that there are a bunch of things we don't understand very well, having to do with culture and such, and some things we understand a little better, like economies of scale and the size of the market and so forth, all of which are relevant, because it isn't as if the anarcho-capitalist society is going to be perfect. I mean, that's why I always like to say that utopia is not an option. I don't know if I coined that phrase or picked it up from somebody else, but I've used it for a long time. And since there are going to be ways in which the entirely free system gets the wrong result, if you're unlucky, those ways are lethal. You know, they result in someone invading you and conquering you, and then the system doesn't work. Or other things could go wrong. You can imagine a lot of things going wrong. And that if you look at historical stateless societies, they vary a lot. That one of the more successful ones, I think, was the Comanche Indians. And they really had no government. I read up on them for the book I'm working on. And it wasn't a very nice society, though. I mean, they did a lot of beating each other up. There's a lot of sort of casual violence. They treated women quite badly. On the other hand, we think of national defense as the hard problem, and they were ferociously good at not only defending themselves, but attacking other people. That basically, the summary I saw was that they prevented American expansion across Texas for something like 20 years. And that's with a smaller population, a lower technology, but people who were very good at raiding and stealing stuff and killing people and sort of doing military things. So it's sort of an interesting case. On the other hand, Iceland, which is not a fully anarchist system, but has a lot of the features of it, as far as I can tell, it was by standards of medieval society, it was a pretty good one. It worked fairly well. Not very rich, but that was an environment they were in, and got a lot of other examples. But it's also true, of course, of governments. The example I started with, that Weimar Germany gives you Nazi Germany, so. Almost any system can go bad. If the business they're providing is basically protecting against criminals, my guess is the economies of scale are not very large, so that you don't observe, for example, that big city police forces do a much better job than small town police forces. Now, there are going to be some advantages in the sense that if you wanted to protect crime by having a policeman on every street corner, that would be easier, but that's probably not a very sensible way of doing it. And of course, when you're investigating one crime, you might find evidence about another, but if that one wasn't against your customer, you can always sell the information to the agency whose customer it was. So I don't see big problems. What is, I think, a potential problem is that the agencies have a sort of implicit threat game against each other. So that they, in bargaining over what the legal rules are, especially if some of them have customers that want one rule and some another, one of the things that affects that bargain is how much each side wants the different rules, but another thing is how badly will it go for each one if they don't reach an agreement. So in that sense, you could think that the sort of one of the products they're producing, and the important one that you want them to produce, is protection for their customers, but another is threats against each other. And at least in some historical cases, big armies have beaten small armies, so you might worry about that. And I guess my basic view is that if the system can once get established, that there's a lot of inertia to that kind of mutual threat game. So that if you think about Europe at present, nobody seriously believes that if the Portuguese decide for some reason to expand their army, that the Spanish-Portuguese border will move half a mile to the east. Even though somewhere behind the history of those countries, there was mutual threat determining where that border was. And so similarly, I suspect that if such a system was what everyone took for granted, had been going for a while, that saying we want to change the rules in our favor and we won't pay you to do it is going to be seen as sort of breaking the rules and everybody will be against you and it won't work. So if you want to modify the legal rules, you have to persuade the other side to go along. That's my guess of how it would work. But again, we don't have adequate theories of a lot of this. Some of what it ultimately comes down to is the field of mathematics called game theory. And that's a very interesting but very unsatisfactory branch of mathematics, in my view. It was started by John von Neumann, who was arguably one of the smartest men of the 20th century. There are a couple of stories I know about, a number of stories about von Neumann. One of them was that another physicist, somebody who got a Nobel Prize, made the comment once, there are two kinds of people in the world, Johnny von Neumann and the rest of us. And there's a similar story about Enrico Fermi, who was a very famous Italian physicist, that when Fermi met von Neumann, Fermi then commented to one of his colleagues, you know, that man is cleverer than I am, just as I'm cleverer than you are. He was not a modest man, and von Neumann tried to solve the general problem of what happens when two or more people are interacting with potential conflicts, where you have strategic behavior and threats and bargaining and all the rest of it. And the idea was that if you really had a rigorous mathematical answer to that question, that would tell you a lot about economics, about games, which is the way he put it, about politics, history, and so forth. He didn't do it. Von Neumann solved one very narrow part of that problem, and he then spent the rest of a very interesting book struggling with the rest of it. And as far as I can tell, nobody since has done much better. We have a few more ideas, but there's really no idea, I think, in game theory, which you can say is a rigorous prediction of what will really happen in the real world. I like to say that when I'm choosing problems to work on, problems that defeated Johnny von Neumann go at the bottom of my pile, because I know he was smarter than I was. So anyway, I think that's part of the reason why I'm not willing to say, yes, I can prove, on paper and pencil, here is the proof my system will always work. It isn't true. But I can't prove it for any other system either. And other systems we know have broken down in various unattractive ways from time to time. Well, if I take technology, my most recent nonfiction book is called Future Imperfect. And it's called that, partly it's a joke with the grammatical meaning of future imperfect, but it's called that because I'm arguing that future technologies could have very good or very bad effects. We can't really say for sure. I guess one of the things I am claiming is that the future is likely to be very different, that there are quite a number of different technologies, each of which could revolutionize our lives. To the extent of wiping out the human race or of making us almost gods, so to speak, or anything in between. And some of those technologies could result in a much freer society. In particular, I think interactions online are in a sense inherently freer than interactions in physical world. Because in the physical world I can punch you and online I can't. I like to say you can't get a bullet through a T1 line. So online, I can insult you. Maybe I can trick you, engage in some fraud to make you give me something. But I can't literally use force against you in the way in which people can in the physical world. So in that respect, the online world seems to me very attractive for libertarians, for people who believe in free societies. It is clear that the online world is going to become more important over time. That particular development is likely to give you a freer society. For a variety of different reasons. First, the fact that you're limited to fraud, you don't have force as an option. Second, the fact that there are technologies that we already know involving what's called public key encryption, such that one can interact online without giving away one's real space identity, so that you could have a future where a lot of what people are doing, I know your online name, as it were. I know how to get messages to you, but I don't have any way of finding your body and doing things to it because I don't know what continent you live in, whether you're a man or a woman or whatever. We know how to do those things. Whether they'll develop, we don't know. It depends how much it matters to people. But you certainly could have a much freer world. You could have a world where it was harder for governments to tax or control people because you can't tax something you can't see and you can't control something you can't see. So that's one set of advantages. A different set of advantages is that the more of your life is lived online, the more mobile you are. That if everything that matters to you is happening in real space, then if you move from one country to another, you lose your friends, you lose your job, and so forth. If, on the other hand, you're working online by telecommuting or something, if many of your friends or people you interact with online, then the cost to you of moving from Spain to Portugal or the United States or Chile or Brazil is much lower. And the lower the cost of moving, the more governments are forced to compete for taxpayers. The more governments are in a position like a private hotel. I like to describe hotels and restaurants as competitive dictatorships, that I have no vote at all in what food the restaurants I go to serve, but I have an absolute vote in whether I go there. And that's a very good way of, I mean, hotels and restaurants are run much better than countries are. And so if the result of the internet is to make people more mobile, that will get countries more like that. And then it won't matter as much what the politics are, because all of the countries will find that unless they treat people reasonably well, there's nobody for them to tax. And so that's a second way in which the technology might make things better. But there are also technologies that could make things worse. Two are the ones that I discuss in Future Imperfect. One of them is surveillance. That it is becoming increasingly common, both by governments and by private stores and things, to have video cameras that are watching people. By itself, that's not particularly scary. But if you combine a lot of video cameras in public places with the software for face recognition, so that you can have a computer look at the recording and produce the names of the people it's seeing, and then you have database software to organize that information, you could have what an author called David Brin, who's mostly a science fiction writer, but wrote one quite interesting book, especially the first 2 chapters that are quite good, called The Transparent Society. And that would be a society where at least everything in public places, anyone with access to the system can see. And anyone with access to the system might mean everybody. It'd be some advantages to being able to see, to check on, what's happening in your house and so forth, where the friend you were supposed to meet is because he hasn't showed up yet. But there would also be disadvantages, especially if the government controlled the system and therefore could watch you all the time. And as I think Brin points out, I don't remember exactly how he puts it, as the technology improves, you could have video cameras with the size and the aerodynamic characteristics of mosquitoes, at which point everything is a public place, essentially. So that's a potentially unattractive world. And as I discuss, part of what's interesting is if both of those technologies happen, so that cyberspace is more private than the world has ever been, and real space is less, what the combination looks like. And I discussed that some. So that's one very dangerous technology. Let me take an entirely unrelated one, but which is also dangerous, and that's the use of drugs to control people. That in a sense, that's a very old technology. That there's a saying in English, candy is dandy, but liquor is quicker. The point being that if a man wants to seduce a woman, one way is to get her drunk. And as we know more and more, both about drugs and about how the mind works, you might develop drugs that are effective, whether by governments or by private people, to control other people. So if you imagine a drug that you can slip into somebody's drink that makes him believe what you tell him, that would be a very simple example. And that's a somewhat frightening possibility, and one can think about ways you could try to prevent that from happening. There are other frightening things that have less to do with freedom. That, for example, artificial intelligence, which is a very interesting, in some ways very attractive idea, that we don't really know what we ourselves are. That I feel as though there's sort of a person inside my head looking out of my eyes, and that's a metaphor. And maybe there's an immaterial soul inside my body. That's not my best guess, but it could be true. And I think the best guess is that what I really am is a computer program or a set of computer programs running on a computer called my brain. It's a biological computer. If that's right, then as we get better and better at building computers and programming them, we are likely to be able to make people, to write computer programs that are as smart as we are. And that would be very interesting. It would mean we'll have a different kind of people in the world. It might be useful for many things. But computers keep getting faster and faster. And that might mean that if in 30 years, which was the estimate that Raymond Kurzweil, a computer pioneer you may know of, made a while back, so it's probably less than that now in his estimate. If in 30 years we have computers that are as smart as we are, it looks as though in 40 years we have computers that are a lot smarter than we are, and that could be scary. So that would be an example. And there are a number of other ways in which technologies could make things worse as well as make things better. And as I discuss those in my book. People who were interested more on that particular question might also be interested. I have another video, a web talk, not an interview, that I did at Google after my book came out. And that's up on the web. You can find it pretty easily. And in that I discuss the book and future technology much more than I am in this interview.